There's a common concept called the overview effect. It's when astronauts go to space for the first time and have a sense of awe as they look down on the Earth. It profoundly changes those who experience it, except so far you have to go to space. Around 2012, Benjamin Grant comes across this and it hits a chord.
Because this idea is just on my mind all the time.
So he starts wondering, could we get this sense of awe, but from our homes without going to space?
I happened to be using a MacBook that had Apple Maps. Thought, I'll type in the word Earth into the search bar and see if it will zoom out, seeing the entire Earth from outer space. And instead of zooming out, it instead zoomed in to a small town called Earth, Texas. When seen from outer space is absolutely stunning visually. And I was just taken aback, and I think in that moment experienced the overview effect.
This led Benjamin to start Daily Overview, sharing one satellite image every day, now to an audience of nearly 1.5 million people on Instagram. Not only that, Benjamin has been sharing his view of the world through books, exhibitions, and even collaborations with huge brands like Louis Vuitton.
Before we get started with the interview, I want to thank today's sponsor, which is OpenCage. If you work with addresses and location data, chances are you're going to need a geocoder. Geocoding is the act of translating coordinates, so think latitude and longitude, that are created by smartphones and tracking devices into human understandable places, like street names and place names, or the other way around. So OpenCage provides a geocoding API, which is built on top of open data sources, one of them being OpenStreetMap. This allows them to provide their geocoding API at a pretty low cost, as well as having pretty loose licensing terms compared to proprietary platforms. So you can do things like store the data as long as you want, display it on any map, and use it publicly or behind a firewall. So if it's built on top of open data sources, you may be wondering, why wouldn't you be able to do it yourself? Well, you can totally make your own geocoder, but what OpenCage provides is just a simple API that works and that is reliable. Basically, they take care of all the maintenance. For example, OpenStreetMap alone gets edited 4 to 5 million times a day. On top of that, OpenCage provides information like local time zones, what currency people use, and which phone code is used. Because OpenCage is based around open data, that means their pricing is also pretty affordable. And they have a pretty generous free trial that I encourage you to go take a look, especially if you're just playing around or are doing a personal project. Finally, which is pretty close to my heart, they've been long supporters of the open source community and just geospatial community as a whole. So if this sounds interesting, you can go to the link in the description to see more about them.
I don't know if you know, but I like starting these conversations with the same question every single time. I like asking people how they would describe themselves. So I'm quite curious, how would you describe yourself?
Wow.
Yeah, we're diving right in.
Yeah, I think I've always prided myself on being more than one thing. I think a lot of people have, a core identity that is just one thing, but I think I've always aspired to be multifaceted and have a variety of interests and do many things. When I introduce myself to people, I often say I'm an author and an artist, which kind of starts the conversation and gets into many of the topics that we'll talk about today. But I think the work that I've done for the last 9 years with Overview has been a combination of many different skills and has kept me interested as the project has continued to change and evolve. And I've had to be anything from a social media influencer to an author to an artist to a public speaker. And I think, if you're just one thing, life can be pretty boring. So I hope to be many things, and we'll talk about a lot of those today with you.
Yeah, that's why I like opening with this question usually, is that it's very open. It can be taken kind of everywhere. So let's dive into overview, and it seems like you started with author and artist. That seems to be the main component that you see in it. So Can you do the same thing about describing what overview is a little bit in a nutshell, when you have to you meet people, you have to describe it to someone. How do you go about
Yeah.
that?
So I started the project, and I call it a project, more so than using a word like business, with no big dreams that it would one day be my full-time job or one day be, even my main focus. It was just kind of a side project and a passion and a hobby. And I think the most consistent way I've described it over the years is a project that uses satellite and aerial imagery to show how humans are impacting the planet. That was the main kind of hypothesis from the beginning of not just showing, beautiful rivers and streams and mountains and lakes, but really focusing on the man-made world. And that is a very broad phrase, human impact on the planet, but it encompasses all of the things that we're doing. All of the cities that we're building, all of the agriculture around the world, all of the energy production, all of the mining, all of the transportation, all of the waste that we generate. And I think because that hypothesis or theme is so broad, effectively you'll never run out of things to show. The world is vast and always changing, and the amount of sensors that we have in space to show that human impact is growing every day. So I think that's kind of the overview of it.
See what you did there.
And I think that sums it up quite nicely.
Can you elaborate? I'd like to go on the beginning of how this story went, if you don't mind. I know you've told this story a few times, but I feel like the people listening might not be aware, and I think the story is quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the full story starts, I'd say, 2012, so maybe about a year before I created Daily Overview. And I have a very good friend who at the time was just going so deep into outer space, kind of a late in life hobby or discovery, or maybe he'd loved it all along, but he had named his house the Sky Lab. He was sending me articles every day about what SpaceX was doing with rockets launching and landing. We were sharing Neil deGrasse Tyson videos, his incredible waxing poetic about the cosmos and our place in it. So space kind of entered into my life in 2012, and I was very inspired to start a space club at the consulting firm where I was working. Space had, on the surface, really absolutely nothing to do with the work that we were doing. It was a branding design firm. But I thought it was a nice opportunity for me and my colleagues to get together, every couple of weeks and just talk about something very different than the work that we were doing day to day at our desks. I had kind of recently graduated from college and couldn't figure out why everyone at this office was, getting their lunch and taking it back to their desk and not interacting with each other. I wanted people to have an excuse to socialize, and space is totally politically correct. You can't talk about religion at work, you can't talk about politics at work, but space, who's going to say no to that? And started this space club. Thankfully did not get fired for doing something that was distracting us from our, billable work. And I kind of became known as like the space guy at the office. Kind of quirky, kind of unusual, but if anyone saw something related to outer space, they'd send me a link to a story, and it was just kind of a known thing, as silly or non-serious as it was, but I thought it was great. One day, one of my colleagues at the office came across this film called Overview. It was created by a group called Planetary Collective, and it was 19 minutes long and in beautiful, stunning imagery, and with interviews of numerous astronauts and philosophers. They talked about this idea known as the overview effect, where Daily Overview got its name from, and Overview, the overall project, gets its name from. I was totally taken aback by this film. I've often said it was 19 minutes long, and I was glued to my screen for the entirety of it. These stunning time lapses of the Earth from outer space, astronauts talking about how they were forever changed by what they saw. You know, when they left for their missions, they thought they were a citizen of Arizona, but they came back and now they're like, I'm from Earth. Seeing, you know, the thin blue atmosphere that separates us from everything else. Just this really interesting, new, life-altering perspective. And I didn't know what to do with that idea besides share this films with other people, you know, with my friends and family. But I was like, this is it. Like, this is the solution to so many problems we're facing right now, you know, in our world where it's all about me and it's all about, you know, my social media feed, and the planet is having this environmental crisis, but we don't know how to look at it or think about it. Just kind of being a potential antidote, albeit, you know, somewhat philosophical or spiritual, to you know, a lot of the important challenges of our time. So that's kind of an important moment in the creation of Daily Overview, because this idea is just on my mind all the time. I'm thinking about it, you know, watching this video over and over again, sending it to friends. So fast forward a couple months, I'm in New York City at the time, walking around, getting directions using Google Maps, and there's that blue dot which symbolizes exactly where you are in any moment. And because Space Club is always looking for new interesting topics to talk about, I'm like, that's a space story, you know, that's a GPS, that's a satellite, you know, or you should say maybe 3 satellites triangulating my location anywhere on the planet. And I'm going to do some more research and figure out, you know, what's the story to talk about satellites for 15-20 minutes. Which is kind of the format of each meeting, where I, you know, prepared a short presentation and then we talked about it. So in the midst of preparing this conversation, I think, you know, of course there are these imaging satellites as well too. We've all been using Google Earth for, I think maybe it came out in 2005 publicly at the time. So at that point, maybe, you know, almost a decade. I'm not sure if those dates are exactly correct, but that's what I think. But again, something that we kind of were taking for granted at that point, that we just have this repository of imagery from all over the world in beautiful detail. So I thought, you know, I'll just pull some satellite images into the presentation and show people, you know, some examples and explain how they work. I happened to be using a MacBook that my work had given me, so it did not have Google Earth on it, but instead had Apple Maps, which at the time had this horrible reputation of sending people to the wrong spot, or, you know, the search functionality was horrible. It was released and just got like the worst press ever for maybe a couple years. But that was what I figured I would use. And it was a very lucky situation that I did, because in the process of preparing some of these satellite images, I thought, you know, I'll type in the word Earth into the search bar and see if it will zoom out and show this overview effect, this idea of seeing the entire Earth from outer space and the perspective that it provides. So I typed in Earth and I pressed enter, and instead of zooming out, it instead zoomed in to a small town called Earth, Texas, which I had never heard of before. I later learned from a Snapple cap that it is the only town in the United States, maybe even the world, called Earth. So for my luck that day, Earth, Texas, when seen from outer space, is absolutely stunning visually. It happens to be in the middle of hundreds, maybe thousands, no, probably hundreds of square miles of pivot irrigation fields. So if you fly over the central United States, you see these perfect circles, which are caused by a line of sprinklers that rotate with a central motor in this circle to irrigate crops that way. I didn't know that's what they were at the time, but my screen on Apple Maps just filled with probably thousands of these circles. And I was just taken aback. And I think in that moment, experienced the overview effect, kind of looking at this vast, enormous landscape. And my brain was forced to reconfigure and create new mental models to understand what I was looking at. And I did a little more research to figure out, where these circles are and what they are. And it started this process of searching and capturing these images. A couple more details to add. Because Apple Maps has an incredibly easy to use interface with the ability to rotate imagery in very precise increments, rather than what Google Earth had, or I think still has, of only 90-degree rotations. I was able to frame these crop circles very precisely, and to make it look what I thought was more like a work of art, not just north-oriented, like perfectly, framed within my screen. And then I took a screenshot. So I was using my computer monitor kind of as the picture frame or the art frame, depending on how you look at it. And a little more context, and maybe the story starts even earlier. When I was a senior at university, I developed a love for art history, and had finished my history requirements, which was my major, and started taking a lot of art history classes, and really fell in love with modern art, particularly a period in modern art history, with artists like Pete Mondrian, who were working in grids and kind of very simplistic straight lines and color blocking. And that is what I think I saw in that image of Earth, Texas, and then a few other searches I did soon thereafter that afternoon in December of 2013, where my mind went immediately to abstract art, where these beautiful places, when seen from directly above, become two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional. Like if you have elevation from an helicopter or an airplane, you get elevation. But when seen from directly above, they become flat, like an abstract painting. So to where we started this conversation, priding myself on being someone who likes more than one thing or likes doing more than one thing, I think slowly but surely I realized that creating images like this combined so many interests of mine, be it photography, be it art history, be it environmentalism, eventually, diving into the world of social media and trying to get this project to go viral. But yeah, that discovery, that first day in Earth, Texas, I think made me really believe, like, oh, I think you found something. Like, I think there's something here, and you'll never run out of things to show. And it was just so exciting. So I'll stop there, but I think that really gets into
yeah, it sounds like
how it started.
Lucky mistake or like error from what the software did from what you expected, like a serendipitous outcome.
100%. And I think because of my interest and experience, I didn't just say, oh, Apple software messed up, moving on to talk about, GPS and other satellites. I think just the world I was in at the time and the amount of art I was seeking out, it was just like an obvious, oh my God, this is beautiful. What can I do with this? How can I, process this image slightly more like, the other photographs that I've been taking to get the colors to pop and to clean it up and to make it into something that is mine and something that is operating on your brain on multiple levels. Because as I got better and better at making the images and composing them, as I would describe it to people, figuring out how much to rotate them, figuring out where to crop them. Because with satellite imagery, you basically have an infinite amount of area to choose from. You have to be an artist and decide where does the image stop, which is probably more important than what's even in the middle of the image. It was just so clear to me that it could be something, much deeper and operate on the viewer's mind like, an abstract painting does in a beautiful art museum. And that composition hits you and makes you feel something. And yet at the same time, I think solves some of the problem that a lot of people have with modern art, in which it is real too. It is a place on the planet. I can give you the geocoordinates, tell you what you're seeing in it, and it operates both on that artistic level and informational level. And it's using the unfamiliar nature of abstract imagery to get your attention and get you interested and get you inquisitive, and then provide you with the context to explain, what's in the frame.
This is why I'm quite excited about this conversation is that moments like this story where you tell that you go in the search bar and you type in Earth and you expect that it's going to show you the Earth, not Earth / Texas. Sorry, Texas.
Yeah.
And I see that as someone who works more on the software engineering side of, like, I think I have a relatively good understanding of what happens on the back end on things like Google Maps or Apple Maps. And it just makes so much sense. I can see the product design conversation about what happens when you type something in the search bar. It looks up, it geocodes it to a latitude, longitude, and that's the only thing that the search bar does. It's not going to zoom out. It's only going to zoom in, because that's always what people are ever going to want to do. And this is what's so interesting, is that you see, the interesting things is going out and seeing the whole thing. It's a completely different idea and approach as to what people who probably are in this so much, like myself, I think, don't even think about doing at some point anymore.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, that is just based off, I think, my background at the time when I started it, of, how I was thinking about the world and how I was thinking about imagery. I think the most obvious recurring example that comes to mind is that people will often comment on a post or email me directly when I post, say, this image of the Eixample district in Barcelona, of the downtown area. I think visually it looks better when south is at the top of the image, just because of the way the city is oriented and the way it is framed up. And so many people will email me and say, this picture is upside down, because I think that's just what they're used to. They're used to looking at the city on Google Maps, or maybe they're even, GIS analysts, and they need the image to be north up. But that's not how I'm approaching this. I'm not approaching this as, I'm giving you a map to get through the city. I want it to be as beautiful as possible. And sometimes that means, south is at the top of the image. And I'm sorry if you get lost by looking at one of my books, but
I mean, you're a monster, and that's okay, but we'll deal with it.
I'm not losing sleep over it, but it's just it's a different approach when I think a lot of people have looked at these images, as data or as something different than art. But, that's just where I was coming from at the time I started, and the perspective I have on it, ever since.
This is what I find interesting about it. It seems like, so you talked about this as a project, and it more than a business. I'd like to get to that a little bit later, but for me, I understand what you're and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I understand from what you're trying to do is to create that sense of amazement, and you've talked about awe in previous talks that you've done, and trying to
Yeah.
create this overview effect of this feeling of a bit overwhelming of we're looking down, and that's the thing that you're trying to optimize for, that you're
Yes.
trying to create a lot. And yet, if when I think of other artists, photographers, for example, like the main thing is they'll talk about getting the shot, like how they went somewhere. What I feel like, and I'm curious to get your take, is you're more of a curator then, because the images have been taken. I don't know if you task satellites, if you work, maybe we can get to that, but I'm guessing most of it is you get access to an archive, and it's
Yeah.
like a huge database of images. And then rather than walking around with a camera and deciding what to point it at, is camera's already being pointed at stuff.
Right.
But there's
Right.
so much of it, you become the kind of the curator, a little bit like a librarian maybe at a library, who's like, this is the book that is interesting out of the millions that we have here.
So, and I think to your first question, going back to that of how would you describe yourself, I often don't call myself a photographer, because people have this concept of me being out there somewhere in the world, pressing the shutter on a camera and then going into
until you go
post
up there with your DSLR and you actually
and
take a picture.
I have in helicopters, but I
Right.
haven't gotten the call yet from Blue Origin, so maybe some point in the future I'll be up there. No, I think curation is one step in the process. I think before curation, there is, and it's not necessarily the same as a normal photographer, but the research of where do you want to curate from. And I think the hypothesis I had in the beginning of I'll focus on where humans are impacting the planet led to so many different ideas and themes and buckets of imagery to choose from. But, I was posting one of these images each and every day for about the first 5 years. I now have a team of people who help me do it. But for those first 5 years, my specific process, and this is the process of the team now as well too, is, what do we want to show today? What haven't we shown before? Let's say we want to do an energy story. Let's do a story about solar. Where are the largest solar facilities in the world? Oh, there are a lot in Spain. Here's a list of all of the largest solar complexes in Spain. Here are the geocoordinates for them. You have to look through, maybe 10 on Google Earth before you find one that's visually pleasing. So now you've got your spot, right? There's that whole kind of initial phase of what do I want to show? And then the curation process starts with the satellite companies that we work with to see, who has the best imagery? Is it cloudy? Is it clear? Do we have one in higher resolution because this is going to be shared, and the crisper it is, the more likely it's going to perform well on social media. So then you got to find the raw file, and then the composition process starts, like I was talking before, of how can I make this look as good as possible? Does it need to be rotated? Does it need to be color corrected? Does it need to be, photo mosaic with, a larger area? There's all sorts of challenges that need to be addressed in getting the image to look as good as possible. Oftentimes I'll download an image and it's completely warped. I don't necessarily know why that happens, but what you think you're going to get is not exactly what you get. And now I'm really good at fixing that in Photoshop to make it look real, rather than contorted, distorted. And then I think the next phase of creating one of these posts occurs in which you need to tell people what it is they're seeing. When I started the project, there was no Chat GPT or any AI that could write my social media copy for me. I'm not sure. Maybe it could now. I'm not sure. But the idea was to describe the image in a very digestible format, thinking that people are already bombarded by what they see in their feeds every day. can I do this in a really concise 3 to 4 sentence, description that tells you what you need to know, or like hits you with a few statistics that, give you the context of what you're seeing, using even tools like Wolfram Alpha is a pretty exceptional tool where you can enter something like, 100 square miles into it, and it will give you, analogs of what that means in a way you can describe, like the I don't know, like that's the Empire State Building laid on its side, like
Oh, interesting.
100 times. You know what I mean? Like, so it's not just some number that's just meaningless. Like it gives you a
Right.
sense of how big this is. So I think the captions, which I wasn't doing like at the very, very beginning of the image, at the beginning of the project, kind of came to be a huge part of it, to give you this context of, if I just showed that first picture of Earth, Texas, with hundreds of circles in the image, people would say, what is that? It's answering that inquisitiveness.
Yeah. And that the
And
story
then,
of this is Earth is like it's not just any place. It has an interesting name that probably makes a lot of sense to tell that story as
leads
well.
to something. Yeah. And as I was focused on human created things, there's obviously a climate story embedded there. And I think this was an incredible way to educate people about why there is a climate crisis, right? Like all of these things that we are doing are contributing to the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So where does that come from? It's a way more complex story than just, the ice is melting, save the polar bears. Like there are too many people. Like there's a bigger story here, and diving into it, almost every day for the past, will be coming up on a decade. A lot of ground has been covered. So yeah.
On that topic, I think this is really so. There's many questions that I have to come up. I want to stay on that on the climate aspect. The thing about satellite images, and you've talked about it, is it's a lot of it can be viewed as art. It's really inspiring. It's these beautiful landscape, things like that. And then we're talking about climate change, where a lot of, if you type climate change in Google or like image, what you see is trees burning and deforestation and it gets pretty
Fires and
depressing
floods. It's
stuff.
the apocalypse. Yeah.
How do you balance that out? Especially because you can't really see a polar bear that's not on an iceberg from space. Like you see something so far away that it also creates a distance in a way. So kind of how are you thinking
Definitely.
about that?
So I think the climate challenge is taking place at a scale that's incredibly hard to fathom. But I think the scale that is offered through these images, gets us closer to an understanding of what is taking place. You throw out a number like 8 billion, like the amount of people that are now on Earth. And that's very hard to comprehend what 8 billion people looks like. But if you look at cities like Tokyo, and you can see the entirety of Tokyo in one frame, or Mexico City or Seoul or Delhi, some of these enormous, metropolises. And then you give the number of, in this frame, there are 40 million people. Like, that's an example of getting at the scale of what's going on, and imagining that 40 million people are consuming and eating and going to the bathroom and using electricity and moving around the city and going about life and all of the good and ill that comes from that. Like, that's just one example of thinking about these things at scale. And it's really hard to convey, these things without pictures sometimes. And this is, I think, the best medium, I think, to talk about climate, because climate is really, a product of everything that's going on in all of us. And all, natural beings, all animals as well too. So yeah, and the other part I'd add to that too is climate change, right? We're talking about change, and I think satellite imagery is also the best way to convey change at scale. So when you have a climate disaster, or you want to show, the entirety of the Amazon rainforest being deforested over the last 3 decades, you can do that. It's really hard to send a photographer to a location and have them take pictures. People have done it, with glaciers receding, movies like Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral, like incredibly determined and unbelievably consistent efforts of photographers to capture one place over time. But satellite imagery is kind of a hack there, and that, you don't need to go up into outer space every time and stand in the same spot and point the camera and say, oh, wow, look how this has changed over the last, 2 years or 2 weeks or 2 days. It is the best way to show change at scale, which I think is another way to understand what's taking place on the planet.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of preaching to the choir here. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious to dive a little bit more into the images themselves. So there's a lot of free open data satellite image that's out there, but having followed the work that you do for quite some while, I noticed it's not those images that you share. It's much higher resolution image. How do you get access to those images? You're working with, I think you mentioned you were working in collaboration with some image providers. Like, can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. So when I made that discovery of Earth, Texas, I was using Apple Maps. And in the following days, I kept making more and more images. I had probably like 40 or 50 of them on my computer, just screenshots of Apple Maps. And it got to the point where I was like, I want to do something with this, and, built a Squarespace website and started posting them, and called it Daily Overview to post one of them every day, and got the Instagram account. And then I think maybe it was my parents or friends were like, are you going to get sued for doing this? Like, are you breaking some, copyright law? Like, is Google going to come after you? Is Apple going to, like, who are you potentially offending right now is the question. And in the product information page on Apple Maps, it said satellite imagery, copyright Digital Globe, the company, which is now Maxar. And I was like, well, who's that? I've never heard of that. And I think at the time, I think most people assumed that, all of Google Earth was Google satellites up there doing Google things. But in actuality, there's this whole, industry of satellite companies that are capturing those images. Again, me being an outsider to the space, I had no idea. I reached out to the Digital Globe PR department and told them I started this blog and would be posting images. Is that okay? And they said, sure, as long as you give us credit, which I did, which was very kind and accepting of them. Fast forward about a year, maybe, someone at Apple learned I was taking screenshots of Apple Maps for those first many months, and they were not okay with it, and they actually told me to stop doing it. And I thought maybe the project was done at that point, because my image source was cut off. But I received a ton of support from the people who were following the project. Within a couple months of doing the first posts, it got picked up by a few blogs like Fast Company, and that one Fast Company article went super viral, and it led to a museum exhibition in Munich, and British Airways put images in their in-flight magazine, and there were all these articles being written about it, and that was extreme validation for me, never having done anything artistic before or anything that had gone viral before. but it gave the project life, and now there was now people following along. And when it stopped, there were people who were even, disappointed that it stopped. So I was disappointed that it stopped. I wanted it to keep going. So at that point, I reached out directly to Digital Globe, and I was like, I can't use Apple Maps anymore. Is there a way, for us to figure out kind of a workaround that I can get images directly? However, it wasn't until I got my first book deal for the book that became Overview that we officially formed a partnership, because now this, project on the side of my desk, hobby thing that I was doing, would now be making money, which was a different calculus. And it was no longer just, exposure on social media. There was potential that this could make money. I think the fact that the book deal was with Penguin Random House, which was a noteworthy publisher, got them even more interested. And we figured out the first agreement with a provider in which they would receive royalties on book sales. And we started, officially working together. And I got access to their archive to create the first book. So that was very transformative for the project, in that I now had access to the full resolution data rather than just doing screenshots on a 4K monitor, which obviously limits your resolution to 4K. It now allowed me to really tap into the true potential of these images, and downloading huge files and learning how to stitch them together in Photoshop, and kind of taking the imagery to the next level. I think the images in the first book are some of the best I've ever done, because it was, the first moment where I could really access all of the pixels. And since then, I've started working with numerous companies. We started working with Nearmap, which is an aerial imagery company. We also work with Planet, based in San Francisco, Airbus. We worked with one point at Axel Space out of Japan. I hope I'm not forgetting anyone right now, but yeah, they've been
those
incredibly
are a lot
supportive.
of the big players, basically, throughout the industry.
Yeah, the moments around the first book, it was kind of a convincing of Digital Globe, now Maxar, that it was worth their while to collaborate with me, even though it wouldn't necessarily be a huge moneymaker in comparison to these government contracts that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That's their core business. But getting satellite imagery into the mainstream culture, and it of course had been at times, but I don't think even they had Instagram at the time. I don't think any of these companies were thinking about it as like something that would be interesting in a B2C world, so to speak. It was all B2B.
Like your average person wouldn't care about any of what they're doing.
Right. Like maybe they had seen, some deforestation images on Nat Geo, or I don't remember seeing very much at the time. Again, I might have just not been in this world, so I might have been on the outside, but the first book did exceptionally well. I poured my heart and soul into it for about a year and a half. Refused to go to many parties, stayed in a lot of nights working very late, and just kind of believed that if this first book did well, it would open a lot of doors for the project and for me. And also, if it did well, I wouldn't have to go back to a consulting job again, and I could, keep this project going in full, because when I got the book deal, I took a leave of absence from my consulting job to write the book, and was hopeful that it could be, a gateway to freedom from the corporate world, so to speak. The book got all this great press. It's been translated into, I think, 9 or 10 languages now, depending on how you count it. And it just, went so many places that I could have never imagined. It was on the front page of the New York Times art section. I started doing a speaking tour and did a TED Talk. It's led to so many different collaborations and brand partnerships. Again, kind of taking these images, that are often seen just as data into the art world, doing exhibitions, doing, museum shows and art galleries all around the world. I could have never expected any of this. I think most books don't do well, but for whatever reason, the timing, how it all came together, the support that I had, the book did great, and it I think also led to more of these partnerships with different imaging companies. They now want their images to be in these books, or posted every day on our social media feed. It's not necessarily going to be a huge moneymaker royalty wise, but we post an image every day to 1.4 million people, and at the bottom of each post, one of these companies gets tagged. So that has a lot of value, especially as more and more companies are entering into the space. As I mentioned earlier, there are more and more sensors going up all the time. Maxar is not the only 30 centimeter resolution company that people can access and work with. I've had multiple companies reach out to me towards the end of last year wanting to work together. It's just kind of a different landscape now. So it's been very interesting to watch that evolve. Again, entering this world in 2013, knowing nothing about the remote sensing industry as it's known. Even that phrase, I think, is very telling of some things. If you said they've remote, what are you sensing remotely? Like, satellite imagery. Of course, there are other sensors, but yeah, it's just been so wild to kind of come in as an outsider, but also work with, as you said, some of the big players in the industry, and see how they work and see how their software works and see, how some work better than other, and to be able to provide, recommendations on how things can improve. Again, not necessarily as someone who's been trained in this world, but having my own perspective and trying to do things that are probably quite different than most use cases. It's just incredible. And I often tell people that we're trying to tell the best stories we possibly can, be it in a book, be it on, the Instagram feed. And oftentimes, working with numerous companies enables us to do just that. If you're only using Maxar imagery or only using Planet imagery, first of all, you're limited to whatever they've captured. And it could be a timing thing, it could be a cloudy thing, but it also can be an altitude thing, or a scale thing, I guess you could call it, in the sense of, well, one story that particularly comes to mind is the Ever Given, the container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. And that felt like a particularly interesting moment when all of the major satellite companies were trying to get the next best image over the course of that. I don't know how long it was stuck, maybe a week. But each of them offered a helpful new perspective to tell that story. And because we worked with all of them, we could share all of those different vantage points. So Maxar had this incredible 30 centimeter image, showing the front of the ship wedged into the side, and you can see, the dirt being moved around it, and it's like incredibly precise. Planet imagery showed, the backlog of ships that were stuck waiting to get through, and you could see, the Ever Given kind of being a small part of the frame blocking it, but then you see 70 ships outside and you've got that scale. So kind of piecing the providers together, I think is something we can do very interestingly, in that, the fully zoomed in shot is not the whole story. So, I mean, it is some of the time, but if you can think of that as almost like the micro view, and then someone like Planet with smaller sats can provide the macro view. They're connecting in an interesting way.
I think that the way I usually think about this is exactly how you use a zoom lens on a camera, which is that you get something that's further out and you get a lot more detail. I don't know if you're doing bird photography, for example, and there's a bird that's on a branch that's really far. You can really zoom in, but the swath, kind of the size of what you can see, that really starts narrowing down, and you really hone in just on one area. But then you can really go out, and if, I don't know, the birds start taking off, and you can take a much wider angle, and you can't zoom in on each bird just as much, but you get this really huge view. And I feel like what you're telling is just the exact same thing, where instead of having the same camera and just different lenses, you have all these different satellites, and you're just trying to tell that story in that way.
Yeah, and I'm sure many people in the GIS world would know this, but Maxar probably can get the image. I mean, they can, of the ship being stuck and the larger context of 50 ships waiting. However, if I want to use their imagery to get that, I'm going to have to process tens of gigabytes of information, and I don't need that level of detail if I'm presenting it on Instagram or even in a small print. It is helpful to have that level of detail if someone asks me to do a 35-foot mural of the Ever Given being stuck. Like that's when that quality is needed. And I have done installations at that size, and then you're dealing with an image that's 120,000 pixels across, and it's a huge file that crashes your computer, and you're figuring out how to work with it, but you make it work, or you buy a new computer to make it work. So I think that's another important part of this too, is thinking about the medium in which you're presenting these images, right? Like if you're just doing an image for Instagram, you don't need very much. I think it's reduced down to, I don't know, 1,800 pixels on the new phones. I don't know exactly, but it's not very much. When you're doing something like prints, and we sell these images in our print shop on our website, or it's the same thing I would be doing for making a piece for a museum. I've had to figure out, what is the right DPI, so dots per inch, and kind of the classic standard is 300 DPI for super high quality prints. How to crop an image so that it can be printed large, but not pixelated. And you're constantly dealing with this balance of how much area can I show in a beautiful way. And of course, higher resolution satellites make it possible to show a smaller amount of area in high resolution. That's why working with a company like Nearmap, whose imagery on their new camera, I think, is going to be 3 centimeter, makes it possible to show it. You would show a polar bear on the ice cap. You could see it. It would be okay. Or for example, if I'm doing a story about cars, in a car factory, I'll use Nearmap, because cars from satellite are not that intriguing. They're not showing it great. So working with all these companies, getting back to your initial question, I think like each offers, pros and cons depending on the story, or they can work together to really tell the full story.
That's on the kind of your supplier side, if we're talking in terms of business. I want to talk about the client side and the people that you've collaborated and worked with. I was really surprised with some of the names that you worked with, and like in a non, like, I didn't expect it. That's what I mean. I think one of the recent
I probably
ones,
didn't either. Yeah.
one of the recent ones is I saw that you collaborated with Louis Vuitton, the
I did.
Handbag company, like super luxurious company. And I'm French, so part of it is also that. But
yeah,
maybe we can take that example. I'd love to dive into that a little bit more about what is the overlap between someone who makes art with satellite images and a luxury brand for handbags, and kind of what does a collaboration like that look like?
Yeah, so that's a particularly interesting example, and I might mention a few others that could be more relevant to what we're talking
Yeah,
about.
please
But
do.
they did this, I guess you'd call it a campaign or a celebration, where they invited 200 visionaries, as they called it, to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the birth of Louis Vuitton. Um, so, I mean, that's a huge honor to be selected. It was, I guess, me personally being able to do effectively whatever I wanted with my medium. Um, in the shape of one of these trunks, kind of the iconic Louis Vuitton trunk. And I decided to do a time lapse, so to speak, of Paris from the 1820s when he was born to a current day satellite image of Paris. And I used a street map from the 1820s that I found in super high resolution from the Library of Congress. And did a story about how, the layout of the streets changed, and then connected it to imagery of the current day. So that was more artistic than some of these other collaborations, in the sense of I had kind of free reign to do what I wanted. And again, to be called a visionary or even an artist, if you asked me 10 years ago, as a recent college grad, what I'd be doing, I probably would say, you probably call me a consultant and, someone who, rides his bike on the weekends. So it's, I think, maybe just a testament to how far the project has come that someone like Louis Vuitton would find it and consider it to be worthy of this, selection of 200 people. Another collaboration that we did last year that I always thought this would be like the most fitting use case for overview imagery was one with The Economist, in which they were doing a kind of recap of the intelligence unit's 75 years, kind of their consulting arm that looks at the world and some of the problems we're facing or we might face in the future. And they had this prepared set of topics that they wanted imagery for. And we were tasked with, finding them. Some examples we're talking about, the increase of renewable energy, or what was going on in the Amazon, or this crazy hypothetical topic that Russia might invade the Ukraine at some point. This was, I guess, at the end of 2021. So to me, it was like, we can create imagery for any story. We have access to imagery from all over the world, and we can do it in a beautiful way, and it's consistent across, 50 images that we create. It's the same perspective. So working with an incredible, organization like The Economist who's doing this research, we can help bring that story to life in a really compelling way. There have been other just kind of unexpected, cool collaborations. There's one you can see behind me, these bear bricks here, which is this trend, which I wasn't even aware of. This company out of Japan who makes these collectibles with artists, kind of at this interesting cause, like scale. We did a collaboration with the rapper Drake. He needed imagery for his new scented candle line, and it was during COVID, so they couldn't get photographers to travel to the 5 locations around the world, which had great meaning to him. So we created, a library of images for them. It's just very practical, right? At the end of the day, I think a lot of agencies or organizations, when they're doing a rebrand or when they're doing a project, and someone in the mood board says, let's do aerial imagery. Historically that's cost a lot of money to get a photographer and a helicopter, and no expectations that you're going to get what you want. And I think to your point of like, who is the consumer, most of these satellite companies don't have an appetite for doing this kind of customer relation back and forth. What kind of imagery do you need? We'll process it for you. Even then, I'm not sure they have people there who would want to, take the time to make it look really good. Because as we know, in its raw form, you can't just press download and get a JPEG in a determined resolution that's super easy and beautiful. There are no guarantees that what you're going to get is worthy of an ad campaign or a website. So it's kind of been this need that's appeared where I think people, come across the project on Instagram or wherever they might see it, and then they've got, an RFP for a new ad campaign that needs aerial imagery, and like, hey, by the way, can you make these images for us? It's like, yeah, absolutely. And then we figure out a cost and make it happen.
So I mentioned earlier, I want to get into the business aspect. It's also something I like asking across a lot of the people I have on the podcast. I like understanding how the money works. I think it's really important. And so is that
Totally.
most of how so you mentioned there's books, there's prints, and then there's partnerships like this. I'm guessing that covers most of the money that comes in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was a time when I was doing speaking tours a lot before COVID, and there was additional money that came in from that. But primarily that's been it. And it's interesting that it's kind of flexed up and down in each of those various brackets, depending on, the year in which it's taken place. When the books were in full steam, that was the majority of the revenue. Prints have always kind of been consistent, but building over time as our following has grown. And yeah, the partnerships thing has definitely been the majority recently. And I think, as we've kind of built a reputation for being able to do this, people come to our website and they see other people we've worked with, and they're excited to work with us. We just wrapped a collaboration with a film production company in the UK. I think it's actually airing the day that we're recording this, in the beginning of January, which was a year in review from outer space. So we put together hundreds of images for them showing, 2022 from space. And again, being able to work with various providers to help them tell those stories is something I think we're kind of uniquely suited to do right now. And I know there are other startups coming online that are saying, we're going to provide imagery at a low cost and make it easy. But what I think they're missing is this kind of additional layer of artistry. Because I don't think this film production company wants an image that they need to throw into Photoshop and fix the, distortion on it, or figure out how to get an image that's, 20 different satellite tiles that are discolored looking, consistent. There's kind of an additional layer that's required to make sure things are looking good until, AI is able to fix it automatically or what. And maybe that it does exist now too, but yeah, I think there's just been this kind of organic need that's grown for this imagery, and we've been able to fill it.
That, in a way, as you were saying that, I feel like in a way it does sound like you've maybe I don't know how this sounds, but you've become like a consultant for applying satellite images to various different artistic projects as well. It's maybe not how you'd like it to be defined.
No, for sure. I mean, I think people often email us and they're like, is this even possible? Like they can't believe that, like, this film studio had been looking around, I think, for a few months, and like it was difficult to work with the satellite companies directly. Licensing images from Getty was like exorbitantly expensive. And because of these kind of unique relationships we have with them, we are able to consult in that capacity, and also then, provide images which can be licensed. So consultants, I think, an accurate term.
No, yeah. I can imagine just that the artist in you probably didn't want to get labeled as a consultant, like trying to get hard.
You can't escape it, It's just one of many one of many ways that I can be described, I guess. So, yeah.
So I worked with radar images for quite some time, which I don't know if you've ever seen, look nothing like optical satellite images that you're familiar with and most people are familiar
Yeah.
with. First of all, it's not like optical, it's not red, blue, green, things like that. And
Yeah.
that one of the challenges is with that and was showing that to people and saying, this is what we see in this image. People are used to, if you show them, you were talking about cars, for example, or a wind farm or anything. Like if you show that to someone, they can conceptualize what it looks like from above. And it's a different point of view. So it's interesting. If you show that in a radar image, but infrared, for example, is a little bit like that. Like we have a sense of intuition of, oh, this person is very bright because it's a person and they're warm and all of that. Have you played around with using different types of data than just the red, blue, green optical imagery?
Very rarely. Um, I think the example that comes to mind is after fires, when I believe they're doing, is it ultraviolet or infrared? When the
It's
imagery kind of
probably infrared.
infrared, when it flips so that um, things that are alive are red, rather, and then the kind of this kind of gray death
Oh,
of
so
things that have
there's
burned.
also indexes to show vegetation that use infrared. And you can
Yeah.
there's a very common one that's called NDVI. It's normalized difference vegetation index, which tells you
Okay.
it's an engineer who named it. Um,
Okay. Yeah.
but yeah, that shows the vegetation in green usually, and then everything else is it's a gradient
Yeah.
of
I
green
think the
usually.
reason that I've avoided it more often than not is that it always requires this additional layer of explanation. And and if we're just showing RGB images, we can just get right into describing it. And it's almost like, there was someone there photographing it, and we're not talking about the source, and we're not talking about the resolution, and we're not talking about the date of capture. Like, we're getting right into what I think is the most interesting detail about what's going on. Um, I think often people, in the GIS world want to know, and they want to ask, or they want us to put a compass on the image to kind of show where north is. And it's like, that's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to like give you this awe-inspiring visual experience, and then inform you what you're seeing. If you need to figure out like what is going on here, or I need to read a lot about what it is that can prevent it from happening. That being said, I think like sometimes, with radar imagery or with infrared or these other sources, you are able to tell stories that can't come through in RGB. Um, One interesting thing that I played around with is, and this isn't necessarily an additional sensor, but I did a series of images with Nearmap using their um, artificial intelligence layers, where you can identify certain objects within the image, be it a swimming pool or a power pole or a solar panel, and made those particular elements a particular color, so that it looked very much like an abstract image, like a painting. So you just have like Beverly Hills, and it's filled with, 1,000 blue rectangles, which are all the pools being isolated in one color. Um, that I think is an interesting development for the imagery of showing you something different in a way that's a bit confusing at first, but when you realize what it is you're seeing, um, you're just kind of floored at the processing power of the AI to identify those specific things, and the sheer number of them in the image, etc. But yeah, have not played around too much with additional sensors, for those reasons that I detail.
What I hear is, maybe again this is more the engineer in me thinking, is that it feels like it's not the right tool for the purpose that you're trying to solve, which is to create that awe-inspiring When I I try to think a little bit when I do things for this podcast. I sort of have a person in mind, like an audience in mind that I'm trying to fit to when I don't know, is this is this what I'm trying to do or not? I try to say, if this person were to listen to this or watch this, would it be fitting for them? And I like to try to use that because if it's something very, very technical, the person that you have in mind is also someone very technical. And then if you're trying to do something for someone that's the general public, usually it's going to be like a family member, for example. If I were at a family dinner and I had to explain this, what language would I use? And I find that to be very helpful in guiding. Do you have something like that for how you frame your art?
It's interesting. The first time I came across your podcast, when you were talking about Daily Overview, I I think you described it as like they're just, giving you the information that you actually want, rather than this, long list of, metadata and resolution and sensors, et cetera, like kind of cut into the chase. Um, and I think that's accurate. And kind of as I said a couple times, like people don't want to read something really, really, really long unless they choose to read something. And when you're going to sit down with this long article or book, it's like a very intentional thing. But if you're just coming across something, I don't think people want to devour more than one paragraph of information. And I think that's who it's targeted for, is someone who just stumbles across this and sees the image on their feed and it's good enough that they stop scrolling. And then they're like, I need to know what this is. Um, and there's almost this kind of like stealth learning aspect of it. Like people will open one of my books and they'll find an image and they'll read, the description, and then they'll turn the page and then they'll read another description, and you know, they're like, man, like I need to come back to this later because I could sit here just, you know, it's good enough, good tidbits enough that it leads you on to the next one, and you scroll for a while and you keep going. Um, so, so I think it's made with like our world in mind, and it's not necessarily about a specific person, but it's like, how are people consuming media? Like how do people discover new things and become inquisitive about the world? Like it's a visual world we live in. This project has taken off alongside Instagram taking off. I think when the project started, Instagram had 250 active users. Sorry, 250 million monthly active users. I'm sure that number is in the billions now. Like Instagram is kind of, it's, with TikTok and maybe Snapchat, like the platforms that people use the most. It's a visual world. I don't necessarily want to enter the metaverse just yet, but people are using their phones more and more, and that's where this, visual imagery, where our art is, observed and digested. So it's, built for that. Even thinking that most of the images we are presenting and make and are now in our print shop are vertically oriented rectangles. That is not a coincidence. The canvas is the phone, and it's just taking an image that's on the phone and then extending it to your wall. Of course, you can rotate it because it's satellite imagery and there's no necessarily correct top or bottom, but we have mirrored the phone. If the phones that we were using were all circles, most of the images we were making would probably be circles. You know what I mean? It's just being aware of how this is consumed and making it accordingly.
Does it worry you a little bit? So we're recording this. It's beginning of 2023. Instagram is going through a lot of changes at the moment. They're very open about the fact that images is great, but reels, whatever they want to call it, those vertical videos, that's the thing that we really want to double down on. Is that something that's worrying you?
I was resistant for quite some time. maybe in 2021 to, hear that change was happening, which is an obvious response to TikTok becoming the thing that people are using, and they need to adapt to compete. But I loved the stills that we were making, and I didn't want to change. Soon enough, things were starting to slow down, either with new followers or with engagement. And we responded by starting to make reels and using the time-lapse feature that Google released to show particular areas over time, but taking that raw imagery, which is made primarily from Landsat data, and amplifying it with our own images. So the Google time-lapse ends in 2020. And what we would do is take 1984 to 2020 and then add in 2021 and 2022 imagery to bring it up to the current day. So that was kind of how we first started doing reels. And then soon enough, we started doing, more time lapses using, just Maxar imagery or just Planet imagery, just a sequence over time. And they, for not so much recently, but for quite some time last year, performed exceptionally well. We probably got about 350,000 new followers last year, primarily from videos and video exposure. A few completely took off with numbers that are almost unbelievable. I think our video of the Dead Sea got like 500,000 likes, was seen by like 57 million views. Like, what does that even mean? I don't know. But a few like that really...
and a half, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, exactly. So clearly they're prioritizing that and more people are seeing. I don't know, if those numbers have led to, more print sales or, anything great on the business front, but it's clear that video is the future on social media. I don't necessarily have too much philosophical thought about that. Like, I think there's something kind of nice to the idea of a still where you're just like observing something and taking it in, and we don't need a 12-second completely insane, video with audio and music and, just one thing to the next. I think there's something kind of peaceful. And the project has always kind of offered this moment of bigger perspective and an opportunity to slow down and think about the bigger picture. But again, I think like this is the best medium for showing change over time. So, a 10-second video where you're able to see, the islands of Dubai forming over the last few decades and deforestation, it is fitting for that medium. It really is fitting. And I think being able to offer something that is informative or educational or awe-inspiring in the midst of the social media landscape, which has become totally insane. And I'm sure everyone has their own feed and sees things that are totally insane. But I think it's a nice respite from that kind of madness. And it's great that it can do well, in the midst of that world as well.
Have you gotten any feedback from the work that you've done from people? Like, do you we've talked quite a lot about trying to create a certain emotion in people, like that's where the project started, and it's reached these ridiculous amounts of people. Do you get feedback from people who come and tell you that it has affected them in a certain way?
Yes. I have actually an email that I have printed out on my desk that someone sent me once. And there have been a few of these, but just, really meaningful, thoughtful feedback. This person said, as a visual species, your pictures have true power to encourage change. Thank you. And that's part of a longer letter just saying, keep going effectively. It's interesting that sometimes people have an expectation that, like, how dare we repost the same picture? Like, it needs to be new and always improving. And feedback about, your image is upside down, like we talked about before. And it's interesting that like we are providing this content for free, and always have. You can subscribe for free and follow along on Instagram for free, with the hopes that it builds to the point where enough people buy a print, or there are enough brands who collaborate with us that will enable it to keep going. I think that's kind of been a new thing that's emerged in the last few years of, Substack and Patreon and creators being able to be paid for their work. We haven't ventured into that world yet. I think people would probably not start paying for something that they've received for free for 9 years. Like that would be kind of an abrupt change. But yeah, letters like the one I just read, or, people responding to the post each day with a comment or a thumbs up, kind of pulls me out of the micro details of like, oh, this is just something that I do, or, it's just work. Because even a passion project can become work after a long time. And remind me that it is a very unique thing to have a platform where you are able to talk about really important stories and really important developments on the planet, and show it and provide something that's not necessarily unique now. Other people are working with satellite images, or the satellite companies all have Instagrams now. Like, we're not the only one, but there is some responsibility that comes with that too. I think to do it really well and to do great things, and to continue to try to be as unbiased as possible, and not necessarily just give the people what they want, but try to tune into like what is the most important thing. Because we could do, pretty pictures of beaches and umbrellas every day, but I don't think that would necessarily be getting at the core issues of our time. So yeah.
I think this is a nice place to start rounding it off. Just like how I like starting the conversation with the same question, I like ending it with the same as well. I like asking people for books and podcast recommendation. I'm sure you're aware it's a bit hard to find new books. Like there's no algorithm for recommending books. I mean, there's Amazon a little bit, and podcasts is a little bit the same. Those are usually a bit hard to discover, and I think they're quite telling on people. So that's why I like to ask. I don't know if there's, let's say, one book and one podcast that you want to recommend, and it does not have to touch on anything that we talked about. Again, back to your point at the very beginning about being multifaceted person. Anything that you think is just worth people's time is great.
Yeah. So you just used the word time, and the book that came to mind was Einstein's Dreams by Alan Lightman. It's a book that I've given to quite a number of people. And a quick summary is that there are just various chapters in which the narrator is describing a world in which time behaves differently. So an example in one chapter, the further up you are, so the higher elevation, time moves slowly. So all the rich people build their houses on stilts, and they look down at everyone else, who's dying in their houses below them. But it turns out the people who are, running through the streams in the valleys are really the ones who are living life. Just an example of all these kind of hypothetical, wonderful worlds that could exist if time were to behave differently than it does. And the podcast I would recommend, one I listen to, not necessarily the most, but always enjoy, is Lex Friedman's podcast. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but just the way that he is so thoughtful with guests. I mean, you've done a similar job today, just really asking good, deeper questions. He himself is a multifaceted human being. He's a researcher and a martial artist and a musician. I think that's what we need more of. People who just have this kind of lust for life, and they do many things, and they love talking to people, and they're kind, and I think he's great. I would love to meet him at some point. Yeah. Those are my two recommendations.
I didn't know about the book, so thanks for that. And I'll take that as a compliment that you thought this was as thoughtful as Lex Friedman. There wouldn't be this podcast without the Lex's work. It's a big inspiration.
Yeah, he's great.
And I too would love to meet him one day. Benjamin, thank you very much for your time. I really do appreciate that. And it was a great conversation. And yeah, thank you for spending some of your valuable time with me.
Can I add one more thought and one more question that I'd love to talk about, unless,
sure,
we got to wrap it. But I think Overview is entering an interesting phase where I've been doing it for 9+ years. It's relatively, I wouldn't say it's on autopilot, but the format is locked in, and we know we're going to get images, and there's so much to create, and there's so many companies to work with. One thing I'm curious, and maybe someone listening to this will have some thoughts and reach out, but figuring out if there's a way where there's like some bigger collaboration, be it with just one of the companies that I work with, be it Maxar, Planet, or Nearmap, where Overview can really serve to be this kind of larger megaphone for their work or their company or the discoveries they're making through imagery. I'm not entirely sure what that looks like, but if there's a way for it to maintain its ability to do the storytelling in a meaningful manner, and also maybe be a part of something bigger, that could be an interesting future for it. So just wanted to throw that out there into the universe. I have no idea what that looks like or what might come of it, but just a thought.
I love this. I think it would be amazing to see anything that would come out of that. I think I'm very much convinced that the art of storytelling is incredibly lacking in this whole remote sensing industry, to use those fancy words again.
Yeah.
And I think there is an incredible opportunity in terms of we're not just creating spreadsheets of names and addresses and things like that. Like, we're creating some of the most beautiful images in the world. And it so happens that a lot of value can be taken and extracted from those images, but they stand on themselves as beautiful pieces of art, as you're showing. So I would love to see more experimentation in trying, and if that can happen with the people who are creating those data sources in the first place, that's probably amazing.
Cool. Well, I'm glad you're on board with the idea. So here's to great things in 2023. Let's see.
Exactly. Benjamin, thanks a lot for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.